going to get crunchier as we move forward in our agenda. In the next panel, we're going to be focusing on some case studies on trends and developments, and it is my pleasure to bring the moderator role over to Alex Delisle, who is the Arctic Associate of the Information Integrity Lab. He also has lots of hats, includes being a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute and a fellow of the North America and Arctic Defense and Security Network. So he's also has a lot of deep experience in the Arctic, personal experience in Finland, and so delighted that he can take on the moderation of this panel. The panel also includes Marisol Maddox, Senior Arctic Fellow at the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth College, and Pauline Baudu, the Director of Climate and Security Program Conference of the Defense Association Institute. And as a late entry, unfortunately, Sonia could not join us this morning, but it's my pleasure to have François Labonté here. François Labonté is Director of the Computer Research Institute of Montreal, or le Centre de Recherche Informatique de Montréal, and he is a key partner of the lab in the detection of visual and multimodal disinformation, and so he'll be addressing some of the trends from that perspective. Alex, in your good hands.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. You've made my job easier by handling the introductions. And I think the first panel also, I don't know if it made my job easier or more complicated because such a rich array of issues were raised. And in this panel, we will be able to dive in a little bit more, look at some of the particular issues that animated that first discussion, and hopefully create a great setup for our final panel, which will get more into the response space. So as Jennifer pointed out, to have a great panel here. And I think, one of the big ideas that was in my mind as I listened to the speakers earlier, it wasn't said explicitly, but is this notion of the poly crisis, that we're at a juncture in human history where we are facing geopolitical rivalry renewing after a few decades, perhaps, of it being in the background. We're facing, rapid climate changes. As someone said in the first one, this affects everything that we do. Rapid technological change that not only is making economic competitiveness all that harder, potentially exacerbating social and economic inequalities, but is also having a profound impact on our democracies, on the role of authoritarian states, both within their own countries and on others, and increasingly, I think, is pointed to in some of the discussion about the United States, even between liberal democracies in some cases. So this all intersects in the Arctic, and I love the mention about context that Bruno made, because it is a very particular context, and frankly, every part of the Arctic has its own local particularities, etc., that really, I think, highlight the challenges of doing successful policy and doing successful analysis. But I'm under no worries whatsoever about successful analysis, given the people we have on stage. So first, each panelist is going to give about 7 to 8 minutes of remarks on some of their recent work, some of the issues on their minds. Then we'll have a bit of a 15 to 20 minute kind of conversation between myself and the panelists. So with that, I will turn first to Pauline, who is going to talk to us a little bit about an array of the kind of conflictuality was one of the words she mentioned to me in the develop, as we talked about this panel, some of the different perspectives on how human security and national security intersect. So Pauline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much also to you and the lab for the invitation. So my presentation is going to somewhat be a case study of the importance of using and spreading accurate information when it comes to framing the security risks that stem from climate change in the Arctic. in order to accurately comprehend the reality of the security impacts, and particularly on the strategic environment and on conflictuality, which is something we hear a lot about when it comes to the Arctic. So I will intend to discuss briefly the myth or the lack of nuance in the mainstream Arctic climate security discourse, what may be true, what may not be, the dynamics that these mainstream discourses feed and how they are leveraged, they may be leveraged to achieve some actors' agenda, and the risks that come with this, sometimes may come with this simplistic or alarmist discourse. So as a disclaimer, I am in no way downplaying here the reality of climate impacts in the Arctic, nor am I downplaying the reality of the evolving regional security situation. The Arctic is going through extreme climate changes and environmental changes that are rapidly accelerating, and the strategic environment of the Arctic is also changing, and it's reasonable to say that we're seeing increasing competition, great power competition, although it depends on the metrics that you're using, but definitely we're seeing more military infrastructure investments, more military exercises, intensifying Arctic rhetoric in national policy documents. These are facts. But what I'm saying is that the causal relation between climate change and so-called increasing competition in the Arctic tends to be overemphasized in what still seems to be the dominant discourse. And so to talk in more concrete terms, I'm sure most of us here have already come across multiple times alarming headlines and analysis on the upcoming Arctic resource war and the intensifying strategic competition, or even the new Cold War that are going to be brought about by climate change, right? Mostly due to increasingly accessible energy resources and to opening sea lanes. And it's fair to say that this is usually the main takeaway that we get in terms of climate impacts in the Arctic. And this narrative is often the way in which we get introduced to the topic of Arctic security. And I'm not saying whether this discourse, this correlation, causal link is going to be true or not. This is not my place to say, right? Whether there will be a new climate Cold War or not. I'm not saying whether this is true or not. But what I'm saying is that, one, there are definitely some nuances to bring to this forecasted causality link, and that, two, the fact that so much attention is focused on this uncertain causal relation and the strategic competition as the primary effect of climate change in the Arctic really overshadows some other very real and immediate impacts of climate change in the Arctic. Because when we dig into academic findings regarding Arctic conflictuality, resources, and navigation prospects, there's nothing tangible for now that really supports this resource war narrative. And you realize that some of the nuances that are sometimes forgotten in this narrative include the fact that, yes, the Arctic may be rich in resources and minerals, and sea ice is receding, but most of the known energy resources are located within the boundaries of Arctic nations, which means their ownership is theoretically not debated, at least hopefully, if in today's world national sovereignty still means something. And another nuance that is missing is that the commercial exploitation of these resources remains uncertain. It's costly, it's still dangerous, especially with permafrost thaw, making building infrastructure in the Arctic even more challenging. And so for now, the majority of these resources are deemed not economically viable for now. Yes, another nuance that's missing in the discourse is that there are legal frameworks governing territory claims in the Arctic, and until now they are still relatively well-functioning. States have been abiding by legal mechanisms to solve their issues. We'll see how it develops. but still a point that stands for now. And then on the battle for sea lanes, yes, sea ice is receding, but climate change for now brings more navigation risks and uncertainty due to intensifying storms, more fog, and as Dr. Jackie Dawson already clearly emphasized, more ice debris and lack of infrastructure that makes navigation all the more costly and the risk of accidents very high. And so it means that, yes, Arctic routes are shorter on paper if you talk about different distances than the other existing routes, but in terms of the time it takes to navigate them and the financial risks and the human risks that are entailed, it's not necessarily more interesting for now than other routes. And you have marine logistics specialists that say that even in the longer term, challenges and access limitations can reap the benefits of navigability in the Northwest Passage. And as for the Northern Sea Route, very interestingly, even the head of the Northern Sea Route Administration, who is supposed to be developing the Northern Sea Route, told President Putin in March that the changes in ice conditions are currently actually complicating navigation. And then a last nuance I wanted to talk about was mentioned by Bruno earlier. It's also the fact that there are different Arctics and that this heterogeneity, this diversity is sometimes missed in the conversation. There are different Arctics, so the Siberian Arctic, the European Arctic, the North American. If we want to break it down that way, it can be also other ways. Geography is a construction, right? But that means different scales of the severity of climate impacts. The Northern Sea Route is opening more rapidly than the Northwest Passage in Canada, and it also means different security priorities depending on how close you are to Russia, for instance. And so when I discussed the topic with a participant to the conference this week, the person asked if this whole framing that I was presenting as problematic was really disinformation, if there is no fake news involved. And I thought the person had a point. It's a fine line between fake news and inaccurate framing. It's a fine line between misinformation and disinformation. And then I heard Andrew Heffernan's statement yesterday that all climate misinformation should be considered disinformation. And so I thought, there we go. But more seriously, I think Andrew's point of selective reporting as a tactic really applies here. And the problem is that this simplistic framing is sometimes conveniently used for political purposes. And so a few reasons why these assumptions are widespread and have traction. One, I think from the perspective of analysts and media actors, sometimes the framing is just used to anchor an analysis in a conversation theme that is trendy, which is climate change. Trendy, we'll see. But to make a paper more relevant or timely, sometimes, which means that you often have, Arctic headlines that mention climate change, and then the rest of the paper is purely on Arctic security trends, and there's nothing in it that really connects directly to climate change. Another reason is that many times I think the objective of analysts using this framing is to try to draw decision makers' attention to climate change at any cost. Because risks tied to strategic competition are considered more convincing to certain audiences than risks to human security, for instance. And this is going to be even truer in the new era, when climate experts are facing unprecedented challenges to maintain political attention to climate risks and are sometimes choosing to resort to more alarmist framings. And other times, it's very openly to underline the prospects of economic profits and generate investment. For example, in January, a headline from The Economist was very openly stating, the Arctic, climate change's great economic opportunity. And the first sentence was that a warming Arctic should yield enormous dividends. So here, the framing very openly toned down the kind of nuances that I'm trying to emphasize here in order to showcase the investment opportunities that climate change presents. And then lastly, at the political and geopolitical level, these narratives end up justifying interest in Arctic territories and in their economic and military development. And so Greenland is kind of case in point for this, as the accessibility of critical minerals has served as a justification of the US administration's rhetoric on the territory. And although the economic profitability of minerals is debated, and I think Marisol is going to touch on this much more in depth, but yes, that was kind of the point. Then I can maybe in the Q&A dive deeper in the risks that are associated with this malframing, but I think for now I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Pauline. That was great. So I will pass the mic quite literally to Marisol.
Great, thank you so much. So I will discuss how the threat environment and the risk environment is changing, because that's something that we need to be very clear-eyed about. And then I'll talk about some of the case studies that we're seeing with Russia in the Arctic, with Greenland, some changes in the types of warfare that China is advancing, and kind of how all of these things connect, and how we need to think about them appropriately to be able to deal with the immense complexity of the contemporary threat environment. So, I want to frame this where it's really not just about climate change. I think we need to be very clear about that. It's not just about climate change and biodiversity. I think the planetary boundaries framework is the best framework that I have seen that accurately shows that, so we have, 9 planetary boundaries. These are things that through very rigorous peer-reviewed science that have been determined as the conditions that have evolved that led to humans evolving to live on this planet. And so if you have 9 planetary boundaries, 6 of those are in the red, only 1 of those is climate change, right? And so we need to be thinking about the climate crisis within the context of the reality of the world, which is made up of complex systems that are very dynamic and constantly interacting. And if we just have this fixation on carbon, we're going to be inappropriately externalizing factors that then amplify other types of risk. And so from a physical and biogeochemical standpoint, that very much needs to be, we need to operate off of the reality of the world that we live in. And then you get into the geopolitics and the behaviors of states and social science and behavioral science, and it gets much more complicated. But if you take a systems approach, then you understand the interlinkages between all of these different types of threats that are evolving, and that allows you to then come up with solutions that can target multiple issues at the same time. Because time is not on our side, resources are not on our side, right? The contemporary, very traditional threat environment is very active, right? I mean, now we have, India and Pakistan to add to the mix of already, the issues that we're seeing in that sense. But that just because the contemporary threat environment is getting more complicated does not make it permissible to ignore the reality of the world that we live in and the changes that we're seeing. And so why this is important to recognize is because we're now at a point where a certain amount of warming has occurred. And so disruption is the new normal. We need to be expecting the unexpected, and that is both from the physical sense, so seeing like, why are Alaska's rivers turning orange? I don't think anybody had that on their bingo card, but you see the intersection of the changes that are occurring with and how climate change intersects, but then how does that cascade and affect things like food security? So having these changes along with all of the other things that drive voter behavior, right? Like inflation and anxiety in general over many legitimate concerns that people have to deal with in their lives on a day-to-day basis. You know, this is where it creates the conditions where targeted information operations have a very receptive audience because of that anxiety, right? And in the United States, I would say that is really, that should be a case study of just how effectively the information environment has been contaminated. You know, these ideas around chemtrails, that it's just a normal thing that comes up in conversation, right? Or conflation of weather modification with geoengineering ideas, right? So all of these issues that are emerging that we need to be anticipating, you know, there's a real disconnect then between the type of rational conversation that we need to be having, where really we need, you know, you kind of think about the strongman persona, you know, typically as, you know, Putin just posturing and, you know, especially when you're weak, you posture to look strong, right? We need to flip that on its head, and we need to have the strongman persona of governments. If you want to maintain legitimacy, you need to be real with your people, because people know, they sense bullshit, right? And people know things are wrong. And I think this was something that really, you know, happened even with the Biden administration, with kind of the focus on electric vehicles and energy. You know, that it's a very kind of myopic approach, when really we need to be taking, you know, an approach to mitigating climate change and adapting to the changed world that we're in a way that really centers the human experience, and the lived human experience and the complexity of that. And so I know we'll get more into the solutions, because that is a really important conversation to be having. But, you know, just to, again, be emphasizing that, you know, disruption's the new normal. We have, you know, more extreme weather events that are affecting people and will be more and more so. We have changing vectors of disease, and when you have challenges with your healthcare system, that just adds to that anxiety and that kind of the challenges to the state. And then we have really more acute financial impacts that are starting to, we're getting hints of, right, around things like insurance and reinsurance and financial risk, where there's really, and I think this actually ties in with what Pauline was saying about kind of how you rationalize certain things, like, oh, this makes sense. We need to make sure we're not inappropriately externalizing factors that are very important to be considering, because if you're like, well, it's not convenient, I don't want to think about it. Okay, but you could be creating other issues, right? And so, you know, this is all taking place during a time where, if you look at the Department of Defense in the US, in December 2024, they had their annual report to Congress on China. And one of the things that they talked about is this advancement of neurocognitive warfare. So in 2015, the PLA Strategic Support Force was created, and this reflected the CCP's understanding that cyber operations are the primary means of psychological manipulation, and specifically looking at the combination of neuroscience and psychology, and kind of that larger cognitive domain operations, to use those as an asymmetric tool to deter the US or a third party from entering into a conflict, to shape perceptions, and to increase societal polarization. So we know that this is something that is a very specific part of China's approach to warfare. And even though the Strategic Support Force was dissolved in 2024, psychological warfare remains a prominent dimension of how China is thinking about warfare. So I think that's also something that we need more research to be understanding how that's playing out within the Arctic context, because that is a region that China is strategically interested in. But where we've really seen, and actually, let me just add that we've already seen them kind of opportunistically trying to advance certain narratives. So with the Lahaina wildfires in Hawaii, there was a CCP-linked attempt to blame that on a weather weapon that the United States military had deployed, and that it was all connected to a land grab to benefit corporations, because then when the land is destroyed from the wildfire and the economy is so based upon tourism, if they lose their livelihood and their homes, there's a higher likelihood that they then have to leave or accept an offer for a really low price for their land. And unfortunately, this is where there's always a kernel of truth, right, of the historic harms or the ways that certain populations have been taken advantage of, that leads to this type of exploitation, where it just creates opportunities for them. And so in Russia, we have seen this, many examples where, especially since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, so in 2023, for instance, there was a severe storm in the Black Sea region, including Crimea, where millions of people lost power and heat, and there were several pro-Kremlin outlets that were blaming a U.S. weather weapon, then also blaming a U.S. seismic weapon for causing earthquakes in Turkey. There was when the Office of Science, Technology and Policy at the White House they issued a 5-year research plan for looking at the potential for research into solar radiation modification. And this was talked about in Russian media as the U.S. is developing a weather weapon to prevent Russia from becoming a major grain producer in 2080. Right, so you can see these little hints of things, and this is only going to become more pronounced as the topic of climate intervention, technology, research, testing, and potential deployment becomes a stronger kind of area of discussion and movement, while not having sufficient governance and seeing this rise of these kind of techno-optimist billionaires who are interested in solutions like that, right? So that's where you just have to understand that complexity to then understand, looking forward, we can anticipate some of the changes we're going to see, and we need to be proactively managing that, because it has the potential to really get out of hand.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Marisol, for that. So technology came up there in a few different ways. I'm from Newfoundland originally, so the idea of a weather weapon, like every day is a weather weapon in Newfoundland, and we don't blame anyone, just the natural environment. François, I'll turn to you. I think that's a good segue in, not Newfoundland's weather weapons, but the idea of technology. I think we've mostly heard about technology here so far as making things more complicated, but you work on kind of the front of technology as part of the solution set, I think, as well. So I turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Nice to meet you. So I've been asked to replace someone who couldn't make it this morning, so I was trying to figure out what I'm going to say. But I think the opening remarks, there's a lot of things that have been mentioned that really echoed our, at least our reality at CRIM. Okay, so the fact that we are kind of in a storm. Okay, this is a typical startup thing in the eye of the storm, but I think it's really the case, and the capacity of our country to adapt to this reality. I think what we do at CRIM has the potential to help in some ways. And maybe I'll just give you rapidly a nutshell of what CRIM is all about, because I know a lot of people have heard the name. It's not crime, okay? This is as an aside. We're a French-speaking organization, and some of my staff who are not that fluent in English, sometimes they're very careful, and instead of mentioning crime in English, when they're speaking English, they mention crime. So all the people are worried that we are a criminal organization, but that's not the case, basically. So basically, CRIM is a not-for-profit organization, okay? And we've been around, it's going to be our 40th birthday in October. And initially, it was created to bridge the gap between academia and industry, because very often, people have the same goal, but they speak very different language. So even as of today, this is what we do. So we're at this frontier of science. So we do science, we do publish a little, but not as much as most of you. But our key strength is really to have the expertise and the know-how to make science work in real life. This seems simple, but in real life, there's a lot of constraint. It's not the exact same problem as for a publication and all this stuff. So this is really where we are, this kind of bridging both worlds. And in terms of this storm that we're facing, okay, our business model is that given we're between both worlds, okay, we need to generate half of our funding from contractual research. It could be government contracts, grants, but on merit, basically, which means that our organization has a business development team, and even though we'd like to work on some interesting stuff, we have no choice to align with priorities of our clients or of our sponsors. Okay? And what I see with this challenge is that there's a lot of ingredients or things that we're doing at CRIM. So we're a strategic partner of the Information Integrity Lab. So our core expertise is in AI, and not because AI is trendy. So we've been doing AI for 40 years, since the beginning, even when it was the winter of AI. At one time, saying you're doing artificial intelligence was not trendy at all. This was kind of one of the worst things. Today, it's the opposite. But we're really focusing on multimodal disinformation. This is our core expertise. So deep fake, generative AI to create artificial content and so on. We're also one of the, we're one of the lead of a government project which is called Climate Data. I don't know if some of you are familiar with this portal, but basically the idea is to give to non-climate specialists, to give them access to climate change information, and in a fluent way through a web portal, giving them the ability to project different indicators in 30, 40 years based on climate change models. So for instance, let's say if you're a civil engineer, your task is to build a new bridge, let's say in Rimouski, far there in Quebec. So the climate portal will give you, like, in 30 years, based on climate change model, how many days of where there will be more than, let's say, 30 millimeters of rain within 24 hours. So making science accessible to population is something we do with climate change. We have a core expertise on Earth, what is called Earth observation, so satellite imagery, monitoring natural resources, and so on. We've also been doing some project on indigenous people culture preservation, so using AI to help them have access to the kind of remaining, historical conversation in different indigenous languages. We have a strong cooperation with another organization similar to ours, which is called ENO. So they're specialized in optics photonics. They have the capacity to develop dedicated sensors to monitor Earth, some sensors that can be put on satellites, some of them to monitor, could be monitor water or so on. They're also involved in the emerging field of quantum communication, so key technologies to ensure our security, and so on. So basically, all these expertise or all of these assets. So we say one of the challenges, okay, we'll need a new strategy, we'll need to think about what we should do, but very often our business at CRIM is, we have clients like this. We say, we have this problem, you're going to do this and this. Okay? And in practice, our people say, no, this is not exactly your problem. In fact, if you need to do this and this, and it will not be the approach that you think. Okay? And I think as part of innovation model, it was just mentioned, we're now in kind of a perpetual crisis, and it's going at an exponential speed. So I think as part of our innovation model, we should think about kind of a bottom-up approach, but directed, not just guessing things, but as we try to devise this new strategy, if it's a real priority. Let's say, like just what I mentioned about CRIM and it's not just to tell you that this is a pitch about our organization. These are all assets that have been publicly funded for years and years, and this talent, as part of our model, it can be put to work on these priorities if they become a real priority. So we have some assets, we have some talents, we have some capacity to get into action as of today. And our challenge, as I think is the challenge of a lot of things in our ecosystem, speed and time is not the most pressing element, okay? So very often we need to think, we need to devise program, we need modalities, we need to evaluate things. So my call to action is basically we should aim at this equilibrium of trying to have, obviously we need a top-down strategic approach to make sure, but as we develop this, let's get into action. Let's do something. Let also this type of bottom-up, but I say not just bottom-up, just guessing, but focusing on some problem. And very often as we work on some problem, it leads us to other problems or other things. So I think this is that, am I good on time?
That's perfect for time. Thank you. Merci, François. You're a hero for stepping in on short notice. And I think, through the three presentations, there's been a lot of great points, but a couple that I kind of settled on were, the importance of calibration, the calibration of the challenge, that everyone recognizes climate change is real, geopolitical rivalry is real, influence campaigns are real. How do we calibrate that in the context of the Arctic? I think the points about the interconnectedness of this, that there's a lot to be learned when we talk about the climate change relationship to disinformation in the Arctic from other places. We heard the Black Sea, we heard Hawaii, and I think that's been a bit of a theme today, that we talk about different regions in the Arctic, but we do need to remember the Arctic is part of a global system as well. And François, I love the point about bottom up at the end, and I think it provides a great segue into both the question I'm going to pose here before I open it to the audience, but for our second panel is about how do we determine and understand the risks? How do we start to look at this complex problem set, as Marisol's put it, for solutions? So getting that kind of moving from, okay, here's the risk, the threat, to okay, here's the risks it presents to us, to here's what we can do about it, and that's largely, I think, a matter of talking about resilience. So perhaps I'll end there if that question is clear enough to think a little bit about risks and then the solution set. I'll probably do that in the same order we did the panel. So Pauline, Marisol, and then François.
So yes, just sticking to my point, which was pathways to build resiliency against simplistic discourses then on climate security issues, and make space for fact-based risk assessments in the Arctic regions. I think maybe three thoughts quickly. The importance of systematically questioning the attribution of climate change, the attribution of security risks to climate change when you come across analysis like this, questioning this attribution. Is this attribution used to actually address environmental challenges through the analysis, or is it to merely justify interest in investing in Arctic regions and expanding military ambitions in the Arctic? So that would be one, maybe just like common sense, critical thinking kind of approach to encourage. Another one would be to Also, sounds like a 101, but sticking to science-based assessments, receiving regular science news, daily newsletters, comparing them to the policy analysis that you come across, to the media articles that you come across on the Arctic. And again, I'm not saying that what we're reading is all false, right? Not at all. It's just that having a general understanding of science facts and the reality of what's happening in the region, having takeaways from scientific reviews on the topic, it really helps building also your critical thinking on maybe introducing nuances in the causality that you come across when you hear that there's a new Cold War about to emerge because sea ice is receding. And then lastly, but importantly, I think to build an accurate information environment, it's listening and giving a platform to lived local experiences and indigenous knowledge on both climate change and security to support fact-based risk assessments and policies that are rooted in the population's security needs. Also sounds like a 101, but we were talking earlier about the importance of co-development when it comes to developing Arctic policies and national security frameworks. So it's key, right? And yeah, I think maybe we can discuss this later, but it really strongly connects to the chapter that Bruno was mentioning earlier about that we co-authored with others as part of the NATO Research Task Group on climate and security. In the Arctic chapter, a key point of this is the importance of integrating indigenous knowledge and giving a platform to it and encouraging co-production when it comes to even just NATO's understanding of climate security impacts on the Arctic, because, well, there's a wealth of not only information, but understandings of the world, different layers of understanding of the world that we're missing if we miss this co-production. And integrating local and indigenous interests and knowledge is just, it's not an option. Like, it's not optional, it's a need and it's an imperative, because they have so much understanding of the awareness of the climate impacts of all these weather changes, sea ice changes, and also on the security level, survival skills, many different things that are absolutely interconnected with the efforts that we're making on the topic. So yes, I feel like it's a bit abstract when I'm trying not to delve too much into the detail because I talk too much, but happy to discuss this later if you're interested.
Talking here is very much encouraged within tight deadlines. Over to Marisol.
Okay. Yeah, so I think on the previous panel, some of the solutions were touched upon, but I think they're worth emphasizing. So Jackie had talked about we need to work together, and that really is at the crux of it. These are transdisciplinary challenges that we need to then have a transdisciplinary both analysis and kind of solution set, right? So things that can facilitate bringing people together to be able to have the people who have expertise with different pieces of the puzzle to be able to have like a Chatham House conversation, where you can kind of have no attribution, so you're able to speak a little more freely. That's really helpful then for helping people in policymakers to be able to really understand the complexity of what they're dealing with and then figure out from a policy perspective what's appropriate then. And then I think, with what Vincent was saying about transparency, again, I think that's so important. Because I think, just increasingly the evidence shows that governments are going to really be challenged, their capacity is going to be really challenged with the different types of needs, basic needs that their populations are challenged with. And so, we won't get to the solutions without working together, but also I think there really needs to be a recognition of the fact that we are living at a time where the threat environment is unlike any time humans have been on Earth, right? And there's very serious threats associated with that, but I would also argue that there's some really fantastic solutions that actually are more meaningful solutions than we will otherwise come up with because they are kind of more holistic, right? And really engaging people in a way that makes them feel like they're a part of something that's more than them, bigger than just themselves, right? And gives meaning. And that's an incredibly powerful tool and way to increase societal cohesion as well. And so it's really the threat around this intersection of climate change and this really complicated information environment is the ways that some of these targeted narratives can amplify distrust of government, of institutions, contribute to democratic backsliding, and also fueling climate denialism. If you can say, well, it wasn't caused by prolonged drought and extreme heat temperatures, this fire was actually from a weather weapon that someone was testing, because they're doing that, right? And then I guess just one other thing I wanted to touch on is, in terms of Greenland, there had been a really great baseline study on Greenland's exposure to disinformation by the Digital Infrastructure think tank. And this is great timing because it was in 2024 this report came out. So it was in Greenland. There's a heavy use of Facebook to be communicating, within the Greenland population. And so this was before before Facebook stopped fact checking. So that's really good baseline information to have. But it also was before the election, Greenland's election, and this kind of some of the really the ways that Greenland has obviously become more prominent in the news with this kind of idea about the U.S. needing to acquire them in order to secure strategic interests, which is also not based in reality. But recently, Danish intelligence said that Russia was behind this fake news narrative saying that somebody from the Danish parliament was seeking Russian aid with regard to the U.S. Greenland situation. And the way that Denmark's intelligence service was able to determine this was through cooperation with the French to understand the influence network that existed that was engaging in the space. So again, this just speaks to the need to be cooperating. These are transboundary issues. Because of capacity, we just need to be working together more than ever and leveraging that expertise and the research that is being conducted because of the ways that these networks are very opportunistically engaging across borders.
François, I don't know if you have a...
I think, going back again to the opening remarks, okay, they'll need some group or some people who will take leadership on what we should do, not on just describing the issues, okay? And CRIM, you think, so I just give you just a quick nutshell. So you think we're techies, okay, but it's completely the opposite, okay? We're an organization that over the year has worked with so many different clients in so many different markets, and the key is not the technology, it's defining the use case that creates value. And this is highly multidisciplinary, okay? And even today, if I was to ask in the room, what should we do? Okay. Not what are the issues, what should we do specifically, okay? This still requires a lot of thinking, a lot of work, a lot of risk assessment, okay? Because we may want to do a lot of things, but it's complex, it's not gonna work, and so on. But this is part of what we do in general. By nature, this is how we work, because we cannot be, and we are not specialists. Even The climate portal I mentioned, so what's very interesting about our organization is we're learning different market as we work deeply with some clients. But we need to engage into, we need some leadership. Is it going to come from defense, from security, from the government, from other, but after that, we need to bring to the table a lot of people. There's a consensus on what should we do, and from there on, and then we move on, and very often this will evolve. Then after what we should do, then we're going to be there to help, maybe telling you what we can do or cannot do. Okay? But it's not starting with technology. But obviously in these AI days, technology can be very powerful and help a lot. So. Yeah.
Thank you to the panelists for this excellent discussion. If we could give them a round of applause.